The first thing I remember is the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing over the canal like a low groan that didn't belong to anything alive. There was a winch whining somewhere out of sight, and then that shape began to rise up through the dark water dripping mud and weeds, like the swamp was reluctant to give it back. I stood on the bank, my shoes sinking into wet ground, watching brown water pour out of door seams and wheel wells slicking the concrete ramp in a slow, filthy river. The late afternoon light was flat and gray, catching on a crescent-shaped scar along the hood, a pale curve of old paint that flashed just once before the mud covered it again. Men in rubber boots shouted to each other, but their voices sounded muffled, like we were all underwater with it breathing that thick smell of silt and gasoline and rotting leaves. Somewhere a radio crackled, a truck door slammed, a bird shrieked from the cypress trees and then went quiet, as if the whole place understood that something old and buried was surfacing. I remember my hand on my own throat, feeling my pulse and realizing I'd seen that curve of paint before, shining in a different light on a different morning when the air had felt warmer and the world less hollow. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back then, before any of that, my world was small in the way that makes you feel safe. Most mornings in October, I woke to the hum of the window unit in my little shotgun house, the fan pushing damp, cool air across the room while the smell of wet pavement drifted in through the cracked window. I'd lie there for a moment listening to the distant sound of a streetcar bell and the soft hiss of cars on St. Charles Avenue and tell myself I had 5 more minutes before I had to be a responsible adult again. By 6:30 I was in the kitchen, barefoot on cool tile, making coffee strong enough to stand up on its own. The radio low, some local station reading out the weather like it was always a polite surprise that rain was coming. New Orleans in October is a strange mix of tired heat and early shadows. You step outside and the air feels like a warm, damp towel, but by late afternoon the light is already slipping away behind the live oaks and power lines. I drive across town to the high school with the windows cracked, the smell of the river hanging faint in the background. Kids' voices leaking out of the bus stops as they waited in uniforms and hoodies, tapping at their phones before the bell. On good days, my job was listening to girls crying over first breakups, to boys who pretended not to care about anything, to parents asking how to keep their kids from slipping through cracks. None of us had built, but all of us were standing near. I liked the routine, the copier that always jammed on the same corner, the secretary who snuck pralines into my desk, the squeak of sneakers in the gym after school, the way the halls emptied out into a brief, echoing quiet before the custodians started their long, slow sweep. Home was a small rental a few blocks over from where my sister lived with her husband, on a tree-lined piece of Pelican Street that always smelled faintly of fried food and wet earth. If I sat on my front steps in the evening, I could see the sagging porch swings up and down the block, hear the slap of screen doors and the murmur of televisions through open windows, the neighborhood settling into itself. Sometimes, just at dusk, you could hear a train horn float in from somewhere beyond the river, that long, lonesome note that makes you feel both rooted and restless at the same time. That fall, though, most of my attention was pointed toward my sister's house, not out of worry, just habit. Rachel was 3 years younger than me, but she'd always felt like the breeze in the family, the one who painted her own bedroom walls at 16 and learned how to stretch $20 into a dinner party. She worked from home as an interior designer, her laptop and fabric swatches spread across the dining table, coffee rings on graph paper, paint chips stuck to the fridge with magnets from places she dreamed of visiting, but hadn't yet. Her husband Ethan was the steady one, tall, quiet, the kind of man who carried extra jumper cables in his trunk and knew which neighbor's kid was applying to which college because he'd asked them in the driveway. From my porch, I could often see the warm rectangle of their kitchen window glowing across the way Rachel moving back and forth with a glass of wine in hand, Ethan leaning in to listen as she talked. His tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. They had this tradition, the two of them. Every year on the weekend closest to their anniversary, they drove out to the Atchafalaya Basin. Just the two of them. No friends, no siblings, no work. They were strict about that part. 48 hours, where nobody needs anything from us. Rachel liked to say, her voice half joking, half wistful. They'd camp near the waterfish, cook something simple over a portable stove, and sleep in a tent under the sound of frogs and the distant thrum of boat engines on the bayous. The first year they did it, they came back muddy, sunburned, and happier than I'd seen them since the wedding. After that, it became as permanent as the date itself. I teased them sometimes, called it their swamp honeymoon reset, but the truth is I respected that they carved something out just for themselves, in a world where everything gets crowded, even your own thoughts. That particular October 2016, the air felt heavier than usual, even for us. The local news had a new graphic for every storm spinning out in the Gulf, a bright red pinwheel on a glowing blue map, and people kept one eye on their phones, one eye on the sky. Our streets were still patched from the last big rain, the kind where water pooled up to doorsteps and storm drains belched up leaves and plastic cups. But in between the downpours, life went on in its usual way. Kids walked dogs down the block, somebody barbecued in a tiny front yard, brass music leaked out of an open car passing by. On Pelican Street, it meant people sweeping their steps, checking their gutters, and talking about nothing in particular until the heat pushed them back inside. The morning they were set to leave, I woke before my alarm to the sound of a car door closing across the street. The light was soft and gold through my curtains, and the air coming in through the cracked window was already warm, carrying that mix of wet concrete and something sweet from a neighbor's jasmine. I padded barefoot to the front door, opened it, and saw Ethan's gray SUV angled in their driveway. Tailgate open boxes and bags piled beside it like a tiny organized mountain. Rachel was in cut-off shorts and one of Ethan's old t-shirts, her hair pulled up in a loose knot, a thermos tucked under her arm. She was arguing with him about whether they really needed to bring the extra tarp, her voice light and quick, while he checked the straps on the folded boat they kept on the roof, running his hand along the nylon like it was a living thing that might complain. Across the street, Mrs. Carter, who had lived on that block longer than any of us, shuffled out in her robe with the morning paper tucked against her hip, squinting up at the gray sky. "Y'all see this forecast?" She called out, her voice roughened by years and cigarettes. "Storms all weekend. Road out there floods if you look at it wrong." I remember the way Ethan smiled, that small, polite curve of his mouth he used when he didn't want to worry anyone. "We'll be careful, Miss Jean," he said. "We know those roads. Just a quick trip." Rachel waved her off with the hand that held the thermos. "We'll bring you back some catfish," she added, grinning. And Mrs. Carter shook her head, half amused, half resigned, as if she'd already lost the argument. I leaned against my doorway and watched as they loaded up sleeping bags, rolled tight a cooler sliding into the back, the clink of metal as Ethan checked the camp stove. The smell of coffee mingled with the damp morning, and somewhere down the street, a radio on someone's porch was playing old soul music, soft and crackling. It felt ordinary in that way. Only a well-worn ritual can the same car, the same banter, the same neighbor nagging them about the weather. All of it wrapped in the lazy hum of a Friday on our street. I walked over with a grocery bag of snacks I'd bought for them, a habit at that point, something I did half joking like a mom sending her kids to summer camp. "Trail mix granola bars and the fancy crackers you like," I told Rachel, holding the bag up. She laughed, that quick, bright sound that always seemed to arrive a half-second before her smile. "You spoil us," she said, leaning over the tailgate to grab it. "If you ever get tired of teenagers, you could run logistics for our trips." Ethan gave me a grateful look over the open door. "Thank you," he said. "You're saving us from gas station dinners." I rolled my eyes. "You say that like you're too good for stale chips and mystery hot dogs." We stood there a minute, the three of us listening to the muffled sound of the city already waking up around us. A truck downshifting at the corner, somebody's dog barking at nothing, the hiss of the bus's brakes 2 blocks over. They were running a little behind schedule, not late, just not as early as Ethan liked. He checked his watch, glanced up at the sky again. A low layer of clouds had settled in, that dull, colorless kind that makes the whole world feel like it's under a ceiling. "You still sure about this?" I asked, nodding toward the clouds. "Forecast doesn't look pretty." Rachel shrugged, looping an arm through mine for a second. "If we waited for perfect weather, we'd never leave the house," she said. "It's just rain. We'll be back before you miss us." There was nothing dramatic in it. Nothing that felt like a line I'd remember later. At the time, it was just my sister being herself. Stubborn, optimistic, convinced that the world could be managed with a good plan and a backup tarp. They stopped for coffee on their way out like they always did. I know that only because Rachel texted me a photo from the little corner shop they loved, 2 black coffees on a worn wooden table, a paper map of Louisiana folded between them like an old friend. The light in the photo was yellow and soft, the kind that comes through big windows on a cloudy day, and you could just see the reflection of their faces in the glass surface, her leaning in a bit, him with that faint, contented smile he wore when he was exactly where he wanted to be. "Last civilized caffeine," she wrote under it. "After this, it's whatever Ethan can boil over propane." I texted back a row of heart emojis and a reminder to bring back pictures of anything that didn't involve bait. Then, the school day swallowed me, and their messages drifted to the back of my mind like everything else that wasn't a crying teenager or a ringing office phone. By the time I drove home that afternoon, the sky over the city had sunk even lower. Rain came in waves not hard enough to flood yet, but serious enough to make the wipers work for it, streaking the windshield with long, watery fingers. The highway glistened under the headlights, reflecting red and white and yellow in smeared lines, and every so often I'd catch myself glancing toward the west, where I knew they'd be driving on narrower roads closer to standing water and soft shoulders. Inside my car, it smelled like damp upholstery and the faint spice of the air freshener I kept forgetting to replace. On the radio, the weather report droned on about bands of storms pushing through the announcer's voice calm, in that way that sometimes makes you think you're overreacting to everything. At home, Pelican Street looked washed and quiet. Water beaded on the wrought iron railings. The oak leaves hung low under the weight, and the air tasted like metal if you stood still and breathed through your mouth. I changed into old sweats, turned on a lamp, and heated up leftover gumbo, the smell of andouille and onions filling the house in slow, comforting waves. Across the street, their place was dark as expected. No porch light, no car in the drive, just the faint outline of their windows behind the curtain of rain. It didn't bother me. They were supposed to be gone until Sunday afternoon. If anything, there was a small satisfaction in knowing they were out there doing exactly what they'd planned, honoring their ritual in spite of the forecast. That weekend moved along like most fall weekends in our city. Saturday morning rain eased up for a few hours, leaving the streets slick and shining under a milky sky. I met a friend for brunch, listened to her talk about her grown kids and their stubbornness, then spent the afternoon grading a stack of essays at my dining table while the ceiling fan clicked quietly above me. Every now and then, when the house got too still, I'd step out onto the porch just to listen to the distant hum of the interstate, the chatter from neighbors a few doors down, the whisper of tires through puddles. Once I caught a whiff of wood smoke from somewhere, the kind that means someone's grilling under a makeshift tarp in their backyard, determined not to let the weather win. I thought about Rachel and Ethan, then imagined them in their camp chairs by the water rain tapping on the tent, some little portable lantern casting a circle of light around their faces. Sunday came with a steady, patient drizzle, the kind that seems to soak into your bones even if you don't step outside. I did laundry, answered a few emails, and set my phone on the kitchen counter where I could hear it if it buzzed. They were supposed to be back by evening. That was the loose plan we'd talked about earlier in the week. Before it gets too dark, Ethan had said more to himself than to me, always thinking about roads and visibility and the time it takes to break camp properly. Around 4, I opened my front door and stood in the frame, feeling the cool, damp air on my face, watching the water drip from the eaves in a steady line. Pelican Street was unusually still. Most folks were inside, lights glowing behind curtains, televisions flickering in blue and white. Their driveway, of course, was still empty. I told myself they were probably taking their time letting the tent dry as much as possible before packing it up, waiting out a heavier band of rain somewhere under the cypress trees. I went back inside, turned on another lamp even though it wasn't quite dark yet, and set a pot of coffee to brewing the familiar burble filling the kitchen. As the clock inched toward 6, I noticed myself glancing at the window more often, tracking the slow shift of light from gray to darker gray. The only sound was the soft drip of water from the gutter and the low hum of the refrigerator, a quiet that felt a little thicker than usual, but not enough to call it worry. Still, before I sat down with my mug, I reached over to the wall by my front door and flipped on the porch light, the bulb casting a pale circle across the wet steps and out toward the street. I didn't know why I did it, not exactly. They weren't even due back yet, not officially. But that little cone of light seemed like a promise hanging there in the rainy dusk, waiting for headlights that for the moment simply hadn't turned the corner. I woke up the next morning to that soft gray light that comes when clouds sit low over the city, the kind that makes the whole world feel hushed. My porch light was still on, casting a pale circle onto wet steps that glistened from the night's rain. I hadn't meant to leave it burning, but I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the television humming quietly and my phone on the coffee table beside me. When I blinked awake and saw the clock blinking 7:22, my first thought was ordinary, almost lazy. They're probably already halfway home by now, laughing at how soaked their gear got. I rolled out of the blanket, the floor cold under my feet, and glanced through the front window. Across the street, their driveway was still empty, and their house had that early morning stillness to it, curtains drawn, no lamps on inside. It didn't strike me as strange. They'd said Sunday evening. Maybe they'd decided to linger to enjoy a slow breakfast by the water. Maybe the rain had eased enough for them to take the long way back. I made coffee, the smell filling the kitchen in warm curls of steam. I sliced an apple, turned on the radio, listened to some announcer talking about scattered showers moving northeast. Everything felt peaceful, almost drowsy. When my phone buzzed, I reached for it without thinking, expecting a picture from Rachel, some snapshot of moss hanging from a branch, or Ethan proudly holding up a fish. But it was just a message from a student asking about college essays. By 9, the drizzle outside had picked up again, tapping soft and steady against the windows. I answered emails, folded some laundry, drifted through the house with that Sunday aimlessness we all fall into. I kept glancing toward my phone, not out of worry, just habit. Around noon, I stepped outside to carry recycling to the curb. The air smelled like damp leaves and exhaust from a car passing at the end of the street. That's when something tightened in my chest, small and quick, like a hand pressing lightly against my ribs. Their driveway was empty. Still empty. I told myself it was fine, the basin roads flood people wait. They probably had to move slower than usual. But I checked my phone again. No messages. No missed calls. I tried distracting myself. Cleaned out a drawer, watered the houseplants, rearranged books on a shelf. But every movement felt like waiting. By mid-afternoon, the sky had shifted into deeper shades of gray, the kind that make it feel later than it is. I found myself walking to the porch and peering across the street more often than I wanted to admit. Around 4, I called Rachel. The ringtone felt too loud in the quiet room. It rang and rang, each chime sharp in the humid air until her voicemail picked up her cheerful voice close in the speaker. "Hey, it's Rach. Leave a message." I hung up without speaking. Tried Ethan's number. Same result. Still not panic. Not yet. Just a twinge of unease, like hearing a window rattle in a house you know too well. I reheated coffee I didn't want, stared out the window while the ceiling fan clicked its slow rhythm overhead. A breeze pushed rain sideways against the glass, streaking the world into long, watery lines. At 5, I called again. Both numbers went straight to voicemail. That bothered me more than anything else. Even in the basin, even in those pockets of low signal, you usually get a ring or two before it fails. My mind tried to reason with itself. Old towers, flooded roads, maybe they turned their phones off to keep them dry. But unease has its own way of breathing. It fills up a room. By 6, streetlights were flickering on one by one along Pelican Street. The damp air made each bulb glow with a faint halo. Cars rolled slowly over the wet asphalt tires, whispering through shallow puddles. In the kitchen, the soup I'd heated sat untouched, cooling on the stove. I sat on my couch with the phone in my hand, staring at the screen. I kept telling myself they'd walk through their door any minute, that I'd see headlights sweep across the front of their house. That was the picture in my head, those headlights cutting through the dark, the sound of the SUV pulling into the driveway doors opening, Rachel calling my name from across the street. At 7, I called my sister-in-law. No answer. Called again. Finally, she picked up, her voice thick with evening fatigue. When I asked if she'd heard from them, she paused longer than she should have. "No," she said slowly. "But you know them. Maybe they're stuck somewhere without service." "Both phones?" I asked. "That happens out there." She was trying to keep her voice light. It didn't quite land. After that call, something inside me shifted a small click of understanding I didn't want to acknowledge. I paced the living room, opened the curtains, closed them, checked the street again. At 8:30, I called the hospital closest to the basin. I don't know what I expected them to tell me. I just needed someone to say they were fine, someone to anchor my imagination in reality. But the woman on the line said no one by either of their names had been admitted. Her voice was soft, practiced. She'd had this conversation with other families before. When I hung up, the house felt too quiet. I walked out onto the porch, the boards cool under my bare feet. The air smelled like wet wood and something faintly metallic. The smell you get after days of rain, soaking everything down to its bones. Across the street, their house looked darker than usual. The windows reflected the streetlights, just flat panes of dim yellow and shadow. Nothing moved behind them. By 9, I stopped pretending I wasn't worried. I called the police station, the non-emergency line, and explained who they were, where they were supposed to be, and that they weren't answering their phones. The officer was polite, professional, and almost careful with his tone. "Adults do get delayed," he said. "Weather out there isn't great. Sometimes folks underestimate how slow they have to move on those basin roads. Let's give it some time." I'd expected that answer. Still, hearing it tightened something in me. I walked the length of my living room phone pressed against my chest and felt the weight of the moment begin to settle, that subtle, unmistakable realization that you've crossed from inconvenience into something else. Something with no clear shape yet, but heavy enough to feel. I tried calling again at 10. Straight to voicemail. Both numbers. My mind kept replaying little moments from their morning, Ethan tightening the roof straps, Rachel waving her thermos, Mrs. Carter shaking her head at the sky. Those ordinary images felt suddenly fragile, like glass that could shatter if I thought too hard about them. I stepped outside again. Pelican Street had gone still. The kind of still that only comes when every house has pulled its people inside. Every porch light has been left on a little longer than usual. The rain had dropped to a drizzle soft as static, speckling my arms with cool pinpricks. A car turned at the far corner, headlights sweeping across the wet pavement, but it wasn't theirs. Just an old sedan rolling quietly past the driver hunched close to the wheel. By 11, my hands were trembling. Not dramatically, just a light, constant tremor born from hours of waiting. I stood in my kitchen staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight, and I knew deep down in a place I didn't want to touch that something was wrong. Really wrong. At 11:42, I dialed the police again. This time my voice wavered, and the officer must have heard something in it because he didn't ask me to wait until morning. He told me someone would come by to talk to me just to get more information. I thanked him, though the words felt thin. Then I sat on the edge of the couch porch, light still burning across the street like a beacon no one was returning to, and listened to the subtle hush of the neighborhood settling in for the night. Minutes slipped by, slow and heavy. The hum of the air conditioner droned steady against the quiet. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then stopped as if even it sensed the change in the air. When the faint wash of headlights finally appeared at the end of the street, rolling slowly toward my house, I felt my breath catch. A white Parish cruiser pulled to the curb in front of my steps engine, idling softly. Windshield streaked with mist. The driver's door opened with a low creak. A silhouette stepped out, boots hitting the wet pavement. He stood for a moment under the street lamp rain beating on the brim of his hat before starting up my walkway. That was the moment the last of the ordinary world slipped away, the moment I understood that we weren't waiting anymore. We were beginning. The deputy who stepped onto my porch that night carried the smell of wet canvas and road dust with him, the kind that clings to you when you've been out in the rain for hours. His voice was steady when he asked me to go over the timeline again, but I could see the caution in his eyes, the way seasoned officers brace themselves when they sense a situation turning into something heavier. While we talked, moisture gathered on the brim of his hat, dripping down in slow taps onto the wooden boards. Behind him, his cruiser idled low and even red taillights glinting against the slick pavement. When he finished taking notes, he glanced across the street toward my sister's dark house, then back at me. "We'll start looking first thing in the morning," he said. "If they headed toward the basin, daylight will help." It was almost 1 a.m. by then, and the neighborhood was hushed, only the occasional rustle of wind through soaked leaves breaking the stillness. I thanked him, though the words felt small, and watched the cruiser pull away its headlights, washing over the rain-polished road before disappearing around the corner. I barely slept. The air in my house felt too warm, too close. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Rachel and Ethan out there somewhere, cold wet, trying to call. When dawn finally crept in, the light was pale and thin, filtering through a sky still stitched with clouds. I drove to their place, stood in the middle of their quiet living room for a moment, then locked up again and waited on my own porch for the first marked vehicle to arrive. Just after sunrise, a Parish truck and 2 cruisers turned onto Pelican Street. Their tires hissed against the damp asphalt. Detective Mark Ellison stepped out of the lead truck, a tall man with a graying beard and the kind of posture that comes from decades of long shifts and hard truths. He looked up at the cloud-choked sky as if measuring how long the weather would hold, then walked toward me with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "We're working with a narrow window," he said, shaking my hand, his palm cool from the morning air. "Let's get started." Neighbors had gathered on porches by then, all in robes and slippers, arms folded tight against the chill. Mrs. Carter watched from her steps, her mouth set in a hard line, the newspaper forgotten in her hands. By 7:30, the search had officially begun. Patrol cars fanned out along the highway heading west toward the basin. Ellison asked me to ride with him to the last solid pinpoint we had, the gas station about 2 hours outside the city, where a cashier had reported seeing a couple matching their description the day before. The ride out was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of wipers clearing mist from the windshield. Fields on either side of the road, blurred in shades of brown and green, still heavy with rain from the storm system that had swept through over the weekend. I kept watching the mile markers, feeling each one like a step into a place I didn't want to be. When we reached the station, the parking lot was empty except for a battered pickup at the far pump. Inside, the smell of coffee and old fryer oil clung to the air. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, recognized the photos immediately. "They were here," she said, tapping the counter. "Sometime before noon. Bought sandwiches, water, estate map. The time fit. It fit too well. Outside, deputies spread out walking the edges of the property, checking ditches and culverts, scanning for anything the rain might have left behind. Nothing. Not even a tire mark worth writing down. From there, we drove deeper toward the basin, where the road narrowed and the land grew wild. Cypress trees stood in thick clusters, their roots like knotted fists rising out of the water. Mist drifted low across marsh grass, moving in thin sheets that made the world look unfixed, like a photograph still developing. Search vehicles gathered at a small clearing near the old bridge, the last confirmed area anyone had seen a gray SUV with a boat on the roof. A hunter had mentioned it casually in an earlier report, the memory of headlights slipping between the trees at dusk. I stepped out of Ellison's truck and felt the ground soften under my boots. Everything smelled of mud and wet bark. A volunteer unit had already set up a folding table covered in maps, radios lined up in neat rows, and thermoses steaming in the cool air. The wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying the faint metallic scent of floodwater. Ellison unfolded a topographical map over the hood of his truck. His fingers traced the narrow dirt road that cut into the basin. "This stretch floods fast," he said. If they tried to drive through after the rain started, they might have run into trouble. He didn't have to say what kind. I could see it in the way the land pitched downward into thick, standing water. A team of dog handlers arrived, their German shepherds, anxious, pacing tight circles on the wet ground. The handlers clipped on harnesses and led them toward the tree line. The dogs sniffed at the air, ears twitching at every small sound, insects buzzing near the water branches, creaking overhead the low hum of a boat engine miles away. But with the rain that had pounded the basin for 2 straight days, sense had washed clean from the earth. One of the handlers shook his head quietly, a gesture Ellison didn't comment on but certainly noted. Deputies walked the perimeter near the bridge. They found a beer can, a torn plastic bag snagged on a branch, a muddy tire print that didn't match anything, and a single fishing float tangled in reeds, old, sun-faded, and of no use to us. Every object was lifted with care, examined, and dismissed. The first helicopter came mid-morning, a low thrum that vibrated through the trees. I watched it rise beyond the cypress trunks, a white body against the dull sky. It hovered, circled, then drifted farther out across the water. Its blades kicked mist upward, making it look like the basin itself was breathing. Down on the ground, the teams fanned out along the dirt road, forming a long line that moved slowly, eyes fixed downward, radios clipped to shoulders. I followed behind them for a while, my breath turning shallow with every step. The mud sucked at my boots, and the air smelled strongly of decaying leaves. Every few yards, someone would pause, crouch, brush aside debris, and then shake their head. I kept expecting to see something, a piece of clothing, a scrap of tarp, even footprints. But each stretch of ground looked like the last wet earth, broken branches, nothing that pointed anywhere. Around noon, it began to drizzle again. The droplets made soft ticking sounds on the searchers' jackets. A deputy handed me a poncho, his expression gentle, almost apologetic. "You don't have to stay out here," he said. "I'm not leaving," I told him. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. As the rain picked up, the radios crackled with brief updates. A fallen tree blocking one route. A washed-out section of road. A false alarm near a cluster of reeds where someone thought they saw fresh tracks. Deputies worked through all of it, but the ground refused to give up anything of value. Back at the command area, volunteers gathered around the map again. Ellison drew circles around waterways and marked off zones already searched. A ranger pointed out a narrow channel accessible only by boat, saying he'd take a team there next. Another deputy mentioned hearing rumors from locals, stories about sudden sinkholes, about old logging roads that vanished under seasonal floods. "Folks say the basin keeps what it wants," he muttered. Ellison gave him a sharp look as if to keep that kind of talk from spreading. But I'd grown up in Louisiana. I knew how stories take root in places like this where the line between fact and folklore gets muddy. People talked about cars swallowed by storm surge hunters who drifted too far into the maze of channels and never came back. Boats found adrift with no one on board. Rumors settle in the air like humidity until you can't tell what's real. Still, we held on to logic. Maybe they'd taken a wrong turn onto a flooded road. Maybe they'd tried to drive out before the worst of the rain came down. Maybe their car stalled and they walked for help. But each theory crumbled a little when matched against the silence, no calls, no sightings, no trace. By mid-afternoon, fatigue settled heavy in my shoulders. I felt the chill through the poncho, the damp creeping into my sleeves. My throat ached from hours of holding back words I didn't want to say aloud. Across the clearing, deputies leaned against trucks, rubbing the back of their necks, their faces lined with the strain of not finding what they needed to find. A volunteer came back from the road, looking pale. He said he thought he'd heard a voice out near the marsh edge, but when they checked, it was only the sound of wind moving through reeds. Another team reported an unusual indentation in the mud, but the shape didn't hold or match a tire pattern. It was just soft ground collapsing under water weight. Every lead frayed before it formed. As the light started to thin into that late afternoon haze, I found myself standing near the edge of the clearing, staring at the dark water pooled beneath the cypress roots. Ripples moved across the surface, slow and deliberate, as if something just beneath had shifted. A faint earthy smell rose up, silt, wet bark, the deep old scent of places that have seen too much. Ellison walked over to me, his boots squelching softly in the mud. He rubbed at his jaw and studied the horizon where storm clouds hung low, blurring the line between sky and trees. "We'll keep going until daylight's gone," he said quietly. "Then we'll regroup tomorrow." I nodded, though dread had begun to coil in my stomach. Something in the air felt different, not colder, not louder, just charged like the basin was holding its breath. We stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the helicopter making another pass. The wind rustled through the reeds again, a whisper of movement that made the hairs on my arms lift beneath my poncho. That's when a radio on the table crackled sharply, breaking through the muffled quiet. A deputy lifted it, pressed it to his ear, his brow furrowing as he listened. He set the radio down slowly, then glanced toward Ellison. "We've got something," he said. His voice was low, careful, and it made the entire clearing fall still. Ellison didn't move right away. He let the words settle heavy as the air around us before reaching for the map and tracing a finger toward a new stretch of water marked in faint blue. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it, a shift, subtle and dark, like the first distant rumble before a storm breaks open. The radio on the hood of the truck hissed once, then again sharper this time, as if whoever was speaking had moved closer to the microphone. I remember how every head in that clearing turned at the same moment, a quiet ripple of awareness passing through the searchers. Ellison leaned in, brow furrowing as he tried to catch the words under the static. Then he straightened, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. His voice dropped to a tone I hadn't heard from him before. "Let's move. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the kind of controlled urgency that makes your stomach tighten before your mind catches up." Deputies grabbed their radios, volunteers shouldered packs, and within seconds, everyone was in motion. I followed because I couldn't not follow, my boots sinking into the soft ground, my breath growing tight in the cool, humid air. We walked in a long, uneven line toward a narrow canal choked with reeds. The air smelled of stagnant water and crushed vegetation, a heavy scent that clung to the back of my throat. Voices carried low through the trees, sharp commands and short replies. Someone ahead of us raised an arm, signaling for the line to slow. I could see only glimpses through the branches, a flash of a neon vest, the glint of a badge, the shifting of men stepping carefully around something unseen. The reeds rustled in a strange rhythmic way, not like wind, but like something being pulled or pushed beneath the surface. When the crowd parted just enough, I caught a glimpse of a metal curve rising from the dark water. At first, it didn't register as anything familiar, just a rounded shape slick with mud glistening in the weak daylight. Then another piece emerged, pulled slowly by a winch mounted to a flat-bottom boat, the cable trembling under strain. The deputies had roped off a perimeter, but I stood close enough to feel flecks of cold water on my hands as the object broke fully above the surface. Mud poured out in long streams, thick and black, sliding down the sides and dripping back into the canal like the swamp was reluctant to give it up. It was part of a roof, then a window frame, then an entire door intact but sealed shut by time and silt. A vehicle was rising from the bottom of the basin. I felt my knees give just slightly a subtle buckle I tried to cover by shifting my weight. A deputy near me lifted an arm, blocking me from stepping closer. His face was kind, but he didn't need to say anything. I could see everything I needed to see. As the winch groaned, the car came fully out of the water, tilting at an angle. Clumps of weeds fell from the undercarriage. A cloud of silt rose around it, turning the water below into a swirling brown fog. I saw the outline of the hood coated in grime. A pale crescent of scratched metal curved across it, faint but unmistakable. I'd seen that mark on a sunny morning years earlier when Rachel had complained about backing too close to a parking barrier, but laughed it off as if it were nothing. My breath froze in my chest. The deputies knew it too. Their movements changed slower, heavier, as if each step mattered in a different way now. They secured straps around the frame, guiding the winch operator until the car was resting partly on the bank. The smell that came off it was thick and sour, a mix of silt, algae, and years of rot. Ellison crouched beside the driver's door, running his gloved hand along the seam. The windows were unbroken, the doors still locked. Mud streaked down the glass like old tears. He motioned for a technician to join him, and together they worked on the locks with a quiet efficiency that felt almost reverent. I barely heard the conversation around me. A ringing had formed in my ears, high and constant, like something inside my head was straining to block out what my eyes already understood. When the driver's door finally opened, a dark rush of water spilled out, carrying with it leaves, twigs, and the faint glimmer of something plastic. The interior was coated in silt, thick as clay. A map, swollen and torn, clung to the passenger floorboard. A water bottle sat lodged in the cup holder, its label eaten away. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. I felt myself trembling, a fine, relentless vibration moving through my arms. A deputy guided me back a few feet, his voice low. "Let them work," he said. But I could see enough the lack of belongings, the eerie neatness of the interior, the key still resting in the ignition silver and dull under a layer of mud. I recognized the shape of the keychain, even obscured as it was. It was theirs. The car had been under that water for 7 years. 7 years while we searched roads, questioned witnesses, replayed routes, and convinced ourselves there was still a chance. 7 years while the basin kept quiet. Behind me, someone radioed for additional units. I heard words like containment lab team priority sample, but they came through muffled as if underwater. All I could do was grip my own hands together to stop them from shaking. Then Ellison stood, straightened his back, and turned toward me. Even at a distance, his expression said everything. There was no room left for hope. Only facts now. Hard, immovable facts. The forensic team arrived fast, a truck pulling up with its doors swinging open, people stepping out with cases in hand. They moved around the car with the heavy stillness of men and women who had done this for too many families. Cameras clicked. Lights flashed. Measurements were taken. Someone mentioned the missing license plates. Someone else pointed out the gear being in neutral. I caught only fragments, but each one felt like a small blow, steady and unrelenting. As they continued examining the car, a technician called Ellison over to the rear bumper. He leaned down, wiped at a patch of metal, and I saw a faint streak of blue appear beneath the mud. His jaw tightened. He whispered to the technician, who nodded and kept photographing. They were piecing something together, something bigger than the car itself. Hours passed like that, slow and punishing. The sun never quite broke through the clouds, leaving everything tinted a muted gray. My clothes clung damp to my skin. I felt the chill all the way into my bones, as if the cold water from the canal had seeped into me. When they finally lifted the car onto a flatbed, the weight of it made the truck sink slightly on its shocks. The chains rattled. The air filled with the scent of stirred-up silt. Ellison approached me, then his boots heavy in the mud, his face lined deeper than I'd seen it earlier that day. He didn't try to soften anything. He respected me too much for that. "We're treating this as deliberate," he said quietly. "Someone put that car in the water. Slowly. On purpose." The words hit me with a strange, hollow clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just nodded because my body knew how to nod, even when the rest of me felt split apart. He continued explaining the next steps: the lab, the analysis, the tracing of paint, the search for anyone who might have seen something years earlier. I heard him, but the meaning floated somewhere just out of reach, like details in a dream you try to hold on to before waking. The car rolled away, taillights disappearing down the narrow access road, and a deep quiet fell over the canal. The ripples on the water had already calmed. The swamp looked the same as it had any other day, unbothered, eternal. But nothing in my world looked the same. I stood there until the last investigator packed up, until the last radio chirped, until the last flashlight beam swept over the mud and vanished. The air grew colder, heavier. A breeze stirred the reeds, making them whisper against each other in a way that made my skin prickle. Ellison approached once more before heading back to town. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture steady enough to keep me upright. "We'll need you at the sheriff's office tonight," he said. "There's more we have to go over, and you should be there when we call your family." The words settled into the evening air like stones dropping into deep water. He nodded toward his truck. "It's going to be a long night." And with that, the road ahead shifted from desperate hope to the hard machinery of truth, the kind that doesn't care how much you want the world to stay intact. The hours after they hauled that car out of the canal felt unreal, like time had thickened around us. At the sheriff's office, everything smelled of damp uniforms and old coffee, the air conditioning rattling in the ceiling vents. Deputies moved in low, steady rhythms, voices hushed in that way people use when they know the news they're carrying is going to change someone's life. I sat in a small room with a window overlooking the parking lot, watching raindrops streak down the glass while Ellison spoke quietly on the phone to the lab and to the district attorney's office. Every so often he glanced toward me, his expression softening before he looked away again. When they confirmed the car belonged to Ethan and Rachel, no one had to explain anything to me. My body understood before my mind did. My hands went cold. My breath shortened. There was a moment, just a brief one, where every sound in the building dropped away, and all I could hear was the echo of that winch groaning as the vehicle rose from the water. My parents drove through the night to get to Baton Rouge. I met them in the lobby just after dawn, the sky outside still the color of wet concrete. My mother's face crumpled the second she saw me. My father pulled her in tight, his jaw clenched in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. We sat in plastic chairs beneath fluorescent lights that flickered at the edges. A deputy brought us styrofoam cups of coffee none of us touched. That morning stretched wide. Technicians sorted through every inch of that car, peeling away years of mud and silence. Around mid-afternoon, someone from the lab came in with preliminary findings. I only caught pieces, the missing items, the condition of the doors, the paint transfer, the traces of impact. The words they used were measured clinical, but the meaning behind them hung heavy in the air. By the end of that week, the investigation had shifted into something sharper, clearer. Detectives started knocking on doors miles from where the car had been found, talking to fishermen, landowners, old guides who knew the basin better than anyone. That's when a name surfaced, a quiet man who used to take tourists out on the water, someone who remembered an argument years ago between my family and two men working traps along a narrow channel. From there, things moved faster than I was prepared for. The description of a blue pickup, reports from wildlife officers about old conflicts with illegal trapping crews, a father and son whose tempers had been noted more than once. When deputies finally brought those two men in for questioning, the weight of the case settled across the parish like thick fog. I sat in the sheriff's building the day the younger one broke his confession, pieced together in a voice so strained it sounded like it had been trapped inside him for years. The details were terrible in their simplicity, every moment rooted in fear and anger, and decisions made in seconds that could never be undone. The divers went back into the basin with maps, sonar, and coordinates passed along from that confession. Watching them prepare was like watching people suit up for war. The clatter of equipment, the soft click of oxygen tank valves, the quick flashes of light across the water as they checked their gear. The canal where the bodies were believed to be was darker than the others, a still pocket of water where branches hung low enough to brush your shoulders as you passed. When they surfaced hours later with pieces of clothing and an anchor encrusted with shells, the air along the bank seemed to stop moving. I stood a few yards back, my arms wrapped tight around myself, the smell of marsh water thick enough to taste. A second dive team found bone fragments deeper in the silt. They carried everything out with the solemn care of people who understood they were holding the end of a story no one wanted. The identification came by genetic testing, but the medallion, the one I'd given Rachel years earlier, was recognizable even beneath layers of silt. Seeing it laid out on a white cloth felt like someone had reached into the past and placed her memory directly into my hands. The arrest of the father and son was quiet. No struggle, no shouting. Just two men led out of a farmhouse into the headlights of waiting vehicles. When the trial began months later, the courtroom was cold enough that people kept their coats on. The younger man pled guilty and testified. The older one stared straight ahead, unblinking, while prosecutors laid out the evidence: the paint, the damage to the vehicle, the weighted anchors, the route into the water. The jury needed less time than anyone expected. Sentencing came with little ceremony, just the low murmur of papers shuffling and the sound of my mother's breath catching in her chest. One man would never walk free again. The other would grow old behind bars, a life carved into decades by a single violent decision he could never undo. After the trial, Pelican Street felt different. The neighborhood still carried on with its rhythms, kids biking down the block, neighbors waving from porches, someone always frying something fragrant on a weekend afternoon, but underneath it all was a quiet shift. People lingered a little longer at their doors when rain clouds gathered. Mrs. Carter moved slower, her cane tapping softly against the walkway. And at night, when the breeze picked up through the oak branches, there was a hush that hadn't been there before. For me, the weeks that followed blurred together. Friends brought meals. My parents stayed longer than they meant to. The school let me take leave, and I spent mornings walking along the river path, tracing the railings with my fingers, feeling the cold metal ground me when thoughts threatened to pull me under. The smell of the river, muddy, earthy, alive, became something I leaned on when the world felt unsteady. Eventually, I returned to work. The halls of the school, bright with the voices of teenagers, helped bring some normal rhythm back into my days. But grief has a way of sitting just outside your line of sight, waiting for a quiet moment to step forward. Some afternoons, when I drove home and saw their empty driveway, it would wash over me again with the same sharpness as the first night. I don't go to the basin often, but once a year near the anniversary, I make myself drive out there. I walk along one of the safer boardwalks, listening to the frogs and the distant hum of boats, and I let myself feel the weight of it. Not just the loss, but the years of not knowing. The years when every phone call might have been news. The years of searching maps, consulting weather reports, trying to trace a route that kept slipping through our hands. What stays with me most is how still everything felt the day that car came out of the water, as if the whole basin paused, recognizing the gravity of what it was giving back. The reeds barely moved, the air hung thick and even. The birds seemed to hold their breath. I didn't understand it then, but now, I think some places carry memory just as heavily as people do. Life has moved forward in its slow, uneven way. I've learned how to hold space for my sister, in the small rituals, lighting a candle on her birthday, cooking her favorite meal in the fall, setting a photo on the table near the window where the light is softest. Some evenings, if the rain is coming in and the world feels heavy, I'll step out onto my porch and let the cool air settle on my skin. The smell of wet earth always pulls me back to that morning on Pelican Street when everything still felt whole. The truth is, there's no neat ending, just a quiet understanding that some losses become part of you. Not a wound exactly, more like a river under the surface, always moving, sometimes gentle, sometimes rising without warning. What I carry now is simpler than it used to be. Not the fear, not the desperate hope. Just their memory, steady, warm, and unmovable, like that porch light I left burning the night they didn't come home. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.